Welcome to our podcast. Today's topic is gender and colonialism.
We'll be looking at the history, development, and modern-day impact of colonialism on our understanding of gender. But before we get started, we have to define what colonialism actually is.
Colonialism is a practice of domination, which involves the subjugation of one group of people to another.
And to guide our discussion of how colonialism intersects with gender, I'm going to introduce a theorist we'll be referring to, and her name is Maria Lagunes. She dives into how colonialism has constructed our current understanding of gender, and specifically, she defined the term the coloniality of gender, which sheds light on how the colonial gender system is very much destroyed and alienized colonized people from their understandings of gender. We'll dive more deeply into that, but first, let's discuss how Native communities were structured in terms of gender. What were the gender roles of Native Americans pre-colonization?
Pre-colonization, women were typically the caregivers and the gatherers, while men were hunters, traders, political leaders, and warriors. Women were largely in charge of culture preservation, and this varied by tribe.
So, what's the idea of a two-spirit individual in indigenous culture?
So basically, Native American cultures had a very diverse and fluid understanding of gender. There were no rigid binary frameworks that we often associate with gender, and instead, people were deeply respected as two-spirited individuals, which meant that they both carried a degree of male and female spirits. So as a contrast to the traditions of European society, these two-spirited individuals were seen as gifted, and they were even honored in their community for being like a bridge between the masculine and feminine aspects of life. They were typically perceived as healers in the community, visionaries, and even these like double vision medicine workers. Essentially, like two-gendered or double-gender people were respected very much in Native society.
Yeah, in these cultures, gender was often connected to a person's role and contributions to their community rather than being strictly tied to their biological sex. We can see this in some native languages, like the Navajo term Nadlihi, which means one who is transformed, transcending from one gender to another. There's also the Lakota term Wingte, which means a male-bodied individual who took traditionally feminine roles.
So that kind of like brings me to the question of like, how and when did colonialism in the Americas begin?
Well, in 1942, Christopher Columbus made the first European contact to the Americas. And after that, European countries all wanted a part of America. So in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was ratified, where Spain and Portugal divided the Americas so that Spain had the South and Central America, while Portugal had Brazil. In the 1500s, you can really see the Spanish conquistadors take over major civilizations like the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire. And this was mainly for economic gain, to spread Catholicism, and to just gain national power for their country. In the 1600s, English settlers came to America. So you can see Puritans and Pilgrims arriving in small communities like Jamestown, and this is mainly for social, religious, and political freedom from the Catholic Church in England, and they were looking to start a new life for themselves.
And what was the difference between Spanish and English colonization specifically?
Well, Spanish colonization was heavily focused on spreading religion, and they often allowed intermarriages between Spanish settlers and indigenous peoples, which led to a more diverse society. And then in contrast, English colonization was primarily profit-driven, and they excluded Native Americans from their settlements, and they banned intermarriage, which led to a more segregated society, and this put a strong emphasis on maintaining separate identities.
How did the legal codes of the colonial era construct gender norms?
Well, European gender norms differed a lot from natives. Some of them were marriage and family law, which imposed strict gender roles. Women were expected to marry, have children, and manage the household, and their legal identities often merged with their husbands, which limited their independence. And then, regarding property rights, women faced significant restrictions Even when the laws allowed them to own property, married women typically needed their husband's consent to manage it, which showed the male dominance in the economic world during this time in history. Even in the criminal justice system, women often received harsher penalties for sexual-related offenses compared to men, which reflected the societal views on female sexuality. And then for enslaved women, labor laws were particularly brutal, reinforcing racial and gender hierarchies. Which leads to the next question: how was sexual violence used as a tool of colonialism against African and indigenous women?
Well, I think this question can be answered by going into the Spanish caste system, which really kind of put the European understanding of gender and forced it on natives and kind of destroyed their understandings of gender. We see indigenous and African women being placed at the bottom of these Spanish caste systems. They were essentially seen as laborers and sexual objects. And specifically, clothing was used as a means of control over these native women. There was the idea of their clothing being immodest and European clothing being modest, and that idea would, later be used to subjugate more women throughout history. And then in terms of English colonization, we see legal codes like slave codes in Virginia in 1705 that basically allowed white slave owners to sexually assault enslaved women without any legal repercussions. This was obviously detrimental, and it really allowed these slave owners to deem any punishment that they thought was necessary, including sexual assault. But beyond that, the Europeans used these gender laws to sort of perpetuate their power. We see in Virginia, there was this law that children born in the colonies actually took the status of their mothers. And on the surface level, that might seem like a harmless law, but what it really entailed is that these children would essentially become slaves themselves since their mothers were slaves. So this not only allowed sexual assault, but allowed white slave owners to maintain their power with the perpetual supply of slaves.
Right, and we can really see these laws enforcing European gender norms onto indigenous people. There was a major shift from indigenous egalitarian structures towards patriarchal systems, and rather than having gender as not something that really determines your status in society or completely defines a person, it turns into what the Europeans had it as. This includes the marginalization of women, especially indigenous women, as they were stripped of their traditional powers like decision-making abilities and also carrying on their cultural knowledge towards the younger generations.
Yeah, and I think this patriarchal structure that you touch on is very much present in our modern day society, and it's really much because of colonialization and the impacts of that. I mean, in our society, men are taking disproportionately high amounts of leadership positions. We see, like in Congress, for example, 71% of Congress people are men, and we really don't see enough voices in our leadership, which is like a reflection of the colonialistic patriarchal structure. And in terms of sexual violence is still very much prevalent, and unfortunately, it disproportionately impacts women of color. We see minority race women have the highest rates of sexual violence and the least access to reproductive care. So I think that sexual violence right now is still being used as a means of control and a tool that maintains the power structures in a patriarchal society brought by colonialism.
Right, and going back to the idea of two-spirit individuals, I find it really interesting how today we see this idea of like third gender, multiple genders to be extremely controversial in our society. And in these like past societies before they were inflicted by European colonization, they had systems like these. They had third genders, two-spirited people that played major parts in their society.
I think that's a really interesting point that you touch on, because right now we're seeing a lot of debate about gender being either or, like two genders, multiple, but in the past we really don't think about how in Native cultures it was already a norm that gender was fluid and that there wasn't any strict definitions of gender, but that was all until colonialism. So I don't think enough light is shed on the impacts of colonialism on how we per se define gender.
In summary, European colonization significantly disrupted indigenous understandings and gender fluidity. And by imposing these gender norms, the Europeans not only reshaped social structures, but they also enforced a system that marginalized women. and this was a key strategy in maintaining power and control over both individuals and the communities. And by recognizing these historical impacts, it is essential that we continue to navigate and challenge the gender norms we face today.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of remaining questions on the table, like how exactly do we deal with these impacts that colonialism has brought to our society in terms of gender, and how exactly do we define gender fluidity in our current society?
Another question I have is maybe what's a way that we can restore some of these indigenous systems and structures, and how can we make this right? And in that case, like, what would be the difference between preservation of their culture and restoration of their culture?
Yeah, and I think those questions are often hard to deal with, but I think they're very much necessary questions that we need to work hard to find an answer for. But in terms of now, I think it's more important to focus on restoring culture and also preserving it, as we see like there's inadequacies in the reservation system. So I think preserving culture should really be a priority.
Thank you for joining us for today's discussion. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and subscribe for more insights. Until next time, keep questioning and learning.